I'm sure that over the course of time we've all had the experience where the least likely person to come and assist us is the one who emerged. Perhaps we were that least likely person to emerge in the life of someone else. If you think for a moment, we probably all have those experiences where the person that we least expect, maybe because there's an estrangement between us, least suspect because we haven't seen them in years, least expect because maybe they're just not in the position to really help in some way. And that least likely person steps forward and assists us in some great way. A couple examples of that. I remember back at the time both of my parents had passed. I had those types of experiences. Back in 2004 when my mother passed away, I remember the line of people, and in the line of people was a young girl, probably college age at the time. And although she looked a little familiar, I couldn't place her. And she came forward, extended her condolences, identified who she was. As soon as she told me who she was, I knew her. And she said, you know, back when I was in elementary school at St. Amelia's, and you are our priest, both of my parents died. I remembered that. It was a very difficult time. Within a year, she lost both her mother and father. And she said, you were very kind to me and really helped me through that difficult time. And when I heard that your mother died, I knew I had to come here to be with you. Least likely person I expected to see. Hadn't seen her in many years. But I remember her to this very day for taking that time, that effort to come forward. Back in 2011, when my father passed away, one of my friends who lives and works in Chicago came back home for the funeral. I expected, in some senses, that he would. What I did not expect was that he would get on a plane the very day my father died to come and be here the entire week, to be present and of assistance to me. Did not expect that, least thing from my mind that I expected to happen. Probably for all of us, we've had those moments where that least likely person to step up to the plate steps up to the plate in our lives, and we generally remember that person for the rest of our life. If you take that idea of the least likely person to step in to the gospel today, we'll have a deeper understanding of what's going on. Zacchaeus was the least likely person to want to see Jesus. He was the least likely. Why? Well, first of all, he was a tax collector. Now, I always take that personally because my father worked for the IRS for 36 years. So, we always take that a little personal, and I suppose none of us really like the IRS, but in those days, they particularly did not like the tax collectors. Why? Because they extorted more than was expected. And that's how people who were the tax collectors became wealthy. Zacchaeus was least likely to want to see Jesus. He was the tax collector. He was part of the Roman establishment. Not only was he tax collector and part of the Roman establishment, he was least likely to come forward. Why? Because he was the chief tax collector. And not only the chief tax collector, but very wealthy. He was the least expected that somebody would allow him in to see Jesus. We hear Zacchaeus was very short. I also take that rather personally. And least likely that anybody would allow in the front to be able to see Jesus. So, what does the short, wealthy tax collector extortionist do? Climbs a sycamore tree. Least likely thing to happen, I suppose. Now, sycamore trees in the Holy Land are probably about 65, 70 feet tall. So as Zacchaeus climbed this tree, very unlikely of a man to do that given his wealth and position. but nonetheless he did. He probably was towering over, looking down at Jesus. These sycamore trees in the Holy Land are very large. And Jesus, in the eyes of the people, least likely, but knowing Jesus as we do, most likely person to stop, to acknowledge Zacchaeus. Least likely in the eyes of the people, but most likely, since Jesus, our Savior, reaches out to all of us exactly where we are, Jesus reaches out to Zacchaeus, come down from the tree. Least likely person that Jesus would have had dinner with in the eyes of the people, most likely in the eyes of Jesus, and least likely that Jesus will go to his home, but most likely because Jesus is the Savior. I mean to dine at your house tonight. And that whole encounter, that whole experience of being the least likely, Jesus the most likely, ended up in conversion. And we hear Zacchaeus in that great moment of conversion, I give half of what I own to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone, I pay them back multiple times over. Least likely outcome in the eyes of the people, maybe Zacchaeus himself, that he would have gone through that conversion. This weekend, I think the message is very simple for us to understand. Perhaps this particular weekend we're to search out that least likely person to expect us to reach out to them and do so in the coming week. Who is least likely for you to reach out to and do something for them? For our younger people, maybe that least likely person is the person who kind of is always off to the side themselves in the cafeteria at school, and you go and sit with them or invite them to sit with you and your friends. Probably be the least likely thing they would expect. Or perhaps for our younger people who are in school, when you see that person who maybe struggles in a particular subject and you excel in it, maybe you'd be the least likely person to go out of your way up to offer them some help. That least likely person is often the person who has the greatest influence in our life. And maybe for all of us, if there's that individual that we've been estranged from that we need to either forgive or ask forgiveness, to go out of our way this coming week to do that, to be that least likely person when that phone rings, for them to say, you were the last person I thought who would ever be calling me. To be that least likely person to call to ask for that forgiveness. Or in some generous way to perform some act of charity, some act of service, to be that least likely person. Yesterday we had the parish auction. It was a wonderful, wonderful event, and I was particularly grateful for the extra hour of sleep. And in the time period of the church where fewer do participate, the least likely time that the attendance was 25% higher than last year. Least likely moment in time. But yet, so many more stepped up to the plate. Not only to be there in presence, to participate and enjoy the dinner and the auction, but so many more stepped up to work, to serve. Least likely moment. And the generosity was abounding. There were many bidding wars. I got into a couple of them myself. And there was one bidding war. The Knights of Columbus, our council, donated a dinner for 45 from Dinosaur Barbecue. It was valued at $1,500. It went for $5,000. The least likely thing to happen happened. In a time period when many are shying away from being generous towards the church with their treasure, so many stepped up in an extraordinary way to be all the more generous. Maybe the least likely thing is to be that person, to be extraordinarily generous in the life of someone else. story that perhaps I told you before, I don't recall, but it goes back to when I was vocation director. When I was vocation director for the diocese, I received a phone call one day from an elderly lady, and she read an article about me in the newspaper, and in that article it included that I graduated from Riverside High School. She said, I graduated from Riverside High School and grew up on Esser Avenue, right down the street from All Saints Church. She said, I would very much like to meet you, and I would like to help out a seminarian. And so I went to her senior apartment building. It was somewhat across from Mount St. Mary's, more of a diagonal from Mount St. Mary's High School on Delaware Avenue. Figured I didn't have much to worry about going to a senior citizen building. It wasn't a trap. And I remember meeting her in her apartment, and we sat at her little kitchen table having a cup of coffee and talking about Riverside and the old days of the neighborhood, and she shared so many stories. And after a while, she got up from the table, went to her bedroom with her walker, and came back. It was almost a scene from a movie. She plopped down a wad of cash on the table that I remember was some $6,000 in cash. And she said, I would like to help a seminarian. Will you please take this as a donation to help a seminarian? And I thanked her for that great generosity. And I remember writing her a letter that same week to thank her for her generosity. It was within the same year I received a phone call from her daughter. And her daughter said, I'm calling you, you don't know me, but you visited my mother. And I'm calling you to let you know that my mother passed away. And she said, I found your letter going through her apartment. We did not know that she gave you that donation. And she said, I'm wondering if you would do us the honor to bury our mother. And of course I said yes. And she said, may I ask you how you knew my mother? And I explained our visit and how we came to know one another. And she said, well, we were all very puzzled by reading your letter because, you know, that day our mother gave you all of the money she had. She said, we're actually paying for the burial because she has nothing. She said, what is even more astounding that she wanted to help a Roman Catholic seminarian because none of us, including her, are even Catholic. The least likely person to do the most generous of deeds. I remember her to this very day and pray that I always will remember her and model after that example. Maybe there's a little Zacchaeus in each of us, and maybe we're going to be the least likely person to reach out to someone else, to ask for that healing, that conversion, that experience of forgiveness. Perhaps there's some act of generosity, of giving our time, our talent to be the church or some other cause or to some individual. This week, look for that least likely moment of experience and enter into it, just as did Zacchaeus, realizing Jesus to be the most likely to receive him